Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor Jon V. Kofas is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
Hello, welcome to an analytical session on the theologian, university professor, German 16th century intellectual, and one of the greatest in terms of a lasting legacy European intellectuals who launched the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. Martin Luther. Before I go into Martin Luther's role in the Reformation, because there were certainly other reformers, one could argue just as, if not of more significance to Western civilization, to Europe and Western civilization and the world, like John Calvin, the French theologian. Let me point out that religion has always been a means of expressing grievances from pagan times in the ancient world, and also a means of human transcendence. Human beings have always had the desire to express grievances and aspirations and a worldview and a sense of self that transcends the temporal, and to delve into something, let's say, eternal, godlike. The Reformation was no different. So the religion of whether today or of ancient times of paganism, whether monotheism, the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, for example, or pagan religions, have always been intertwined with society. In fact, they are an expression of society. And when they undergo transformation, reformation, in the case of what we're going to discuss, to what I'm going to discuss today, they are indeed reflecting changes in society. They have been intertwined with the elites, especially, for the most part, throughout history, providing a sense of legitimacy to rulers and elites, again, from ancient times, from paganism to the present. They have also provided a sense of legitimacy to acts, everything from war, right? The pagans invariably made sacrifices to the gods before going to war, to making messianic pronouncements about very temporal policies, very earthly policies, but yet rulers and the elites wishing to give a sense of transcendence, a sense of far greater importance to what they're doing. And again, we see this from the ancient times to the war right now between Israel, which Israel launched against Iran with the United States support. We see this because this is something that human beings do in order to make acceptable the events which they enter into, the acts which they entered into. And when I say human beings, I mean especially those who make policy, rulers and the elites behind them, to make that acceptable as a norm to the population, to the average person. The particular issue of Protestantism is no different, except in one respect. The Protestant Reformation took place against the background of what scholars call social discontinuity. That is a school of thought of scholars linked to the French school of thought that was mainly launched by the French historian Fernand Bourdelle. And the social discontinuity simply means that in the 16th century, actually it starts in the mid 15th century, and it's throughout the 16th century. What happens is there was a transition in all of European society, that is in Western Christendom. Western Christendom is the Catholic um, West, basically. Um, there was a transformation from the feudal manorial order to capitalism. And this transformation is what made Protestantism possible. Protestantism, the Protestant Reformation, was an outgrowth of social discontinuity as there were several factors happening from the mid 15th century throughout the 16th century. And that is the waning of the Black Death, which started in the mid 14th century, and the rise in the population by the mid 15th century, late 15th century, the rise in the population and demographic changes in Europe. That's one thing. The second thing is that the transition toward both long distance and short distance, intermediate distance trade between the Europeans, of course, and non-European people, especially after the Portuguese ventured into Africa, followed by the Spaniards, and then the Northwest Europeans following. So we have the convergence of a transition to trade, and the reason for this, and the convergence of trade, as well as the transition from subsistence agriculture to commercial agriculture, which provides surplus, and the surplus is traded. So that's the reason for the trade, both intermediate term within localities, within a nation state. As nation states, by the way, begin to develop during this period. So nascent capitalism, the embryonic stage of capitalism, is also the stage when nation states develop. So we see this transition taking place, which reshapes the social order, the division of labor. So we see a reduction in the serf population, in the peasant population, and very gradually, by the way, because this is still before the Industrial Revolution of England in the 18th century, but a reduction in that population and people moving into urban centers. And we see a rise in mining operations, for example, especially as gold and silver come in from the New World, from the Western Hemisphere, that Spain brings, and that competes with European mining operations. We see the rise of a working class. This is again pre-industrial Europe, partly because of the commercial class, the consolidation of the commercial class. The 16th century, by the way, which is the era of the Protestant Reformation, is also the era of the European commercial revolution. So this is the background against which the social discontinuity, a new mode of production emerging from the feudal manorial to capitalism. The feudal manorial mode of production was dominated by the landowning aristocracy, invariably linked to the upper clergy in the Catholic Church in Western Christendom. The Reformation really represents the ascendancy of the capitalist class, of the bourgeoisie, urban-centered, and having a new worldview, new values, and as we'll see, the Protestant Reformation articulates all of this. This is before the rise of secular ideologies, the first and most important being in the 17th century, in fact, in the late 17th century, by the English scholar, philosopher, John Locke, who obviously is the father of Western liberalism. Before the late 17th century, religion was sort of a substitute, if you will, of a secular ideology expressing grievances, expressing aspirations, giving legitimacy to new social norms in society. And Martin Luther comes along and provides all of this. And he does so at a time that there is this social discontinuity and people become much more individualistic. Now, it's not that Martin Luther invented the wheel here, he is part of a cultural continuity that starts in the Renaissance. It precedes Martin Luther. In fact, it coincides with the Renaissance, coincides with the Black Death. The Renaissance, which the word, of course, is Latin, and it means rebirth of classical civilization, of Greco-Roman values and ideas, based on individualism, based on the individual pursuing endeavors that realize the creative potential of that individual and the derivative benefits, of course, of that means that society benefits as well. This is a very important point because the Reformation thinkers like Luther, Calvin did the same thing in a way, adapt this, and this is transferred on to, and this is embraced, I should say, and transferred on to capitalists who accept this because it suits their pursuits and it suits their ideology. Now, Martin Luther was a theologian by training. His father wanted him to become a lawyer. He became a theologian, a university professor, and turned to religion. He grew up in a society where the value system of the feudal manorial order was identified with Western Christendom, that is Catholicism, and Catholicism stressed salvation through clerical intercession. A communitarian value system, of course, that capitalists reject. They rejected it then, they reject it now. They do not accept communitarian values because it is contrary to the interests of the individual pursuits of capitalists. So Martin Luther rejects the communitarian ideal, not for the reasons that capitalists rejected it then and today, but rather because he believed that human beings achieve salvation not through clerical intercession, that is the intervening of the church and the clergy, and through acts, but rather through faith. There is something else, of course, that he objected to. Martin Luther at the time had visited, by the way, Rome. He had visited the center of the Catholic Church, the Vatican. And what he had found was that the upper clergy, with the papacy at the head, was utterly corrupt. And the corruption was real before Luther. And in fact, the hypocrisy of the church was very real, because 300 years before Martin Luther, the theologian, an Italian intellectual, a transitional figure between the medieval era and the Renaissance, Dante Alighieri, in his classic work, The Inferno, had actually exposed much of the hypocrisy of the Catholic Church and the elites in his time. Okay, so this is hardly again new. Luther is stepping on ground already established, but he is proceeding to expose something else that the church had adopted, the Catholic Church, and very aggressively in his lifetime, called indulgences. Indulgences were a form of payment by the faithful for remission of sins. So, in other words, you pay to achieve salvation. The church was raising money for some of the most unusual reasons. Yes, the church as an institution in Western Christendom was the number one land owning institution in Europe. No one owned more land than the church. Okay? Not that the Catholic Church doesn't have enormous amounts of wealth today on a world scale. Obviously, its own bank, Banco Ambrosiano. The church has been, the Catholic Church has been an institution, a spiritual institution, but yet we're in the real world where money is collected and money is used in various endeavors. Martin Luther found this to be hypocritical, that the spiritual head, namely the Pope, the papacy, and the upper clergy, were immersed in materialism. And yet, they expected the faithful to be saved through this corrupt institution, through clerical intercession. Martin Luther's concern was not the exploitation of the faithful in Europe by the Catholic Church and the elites. Let me say something about the upper clergy, bishops, archbishops, and cardinals, those three groups. They invariably came from the aristocracy. They were landowners. There was hardly a difference in reality between the upper clergy and the nobility, although, again, in theory and as an institution, the church was separate, recognized as such, obviously. The spiritual domain, we had the spiritual domain, it was the spiritual aristocracy, if you will, versus the temporal aristocracy, the secular nobility. However, the reality is the upper clergy was linked to the secular nobility by blood. They came from the secular nobility, and they were themselves nobles, if you will. In some cases, by the way, they were the clothing, the robes of the clergy on Sundays and religious holidays, and then they wore temporal clothing of the nobility, distinguished from the bourgeoisie and the peasants and the farmers and the workers on weekdays. So, but in reality, these were the same people. Luther, however, made a distinction. He did not attack the corruption and the hypocrisy of the elites as a whole, as an entity that was an integral part of society. He attacked only the spiritual aspect, the religious, if you will, the religious aspect the of this institution that was preaching falsehoods, including, by the way, papal infallibility. Papal infallibility is a doctrine that means that the papacy cannot be wrong. Obviously, according to Luther, who was an Augustinian theologian. Saint Augustine, by the way, lived during the decline of the Roman Empire. In fact, wrote a book on the decline of Rome entitled The City of God. And St. Augustine believed in this dichotomy in the temporal city and the city of God, in the spiritual city, the eternal city. Um, Luther was, in fact, part of the Augustinian monastic order. He was an Augustinian. He saw things in the way St. Augustine did. So he differentiated between the religious uh, elites and the temporal, the secular. He had no concerns about the temporal world and the secular institutions, just the religious ones. He wanted, in other words, to save people's souls. Okay. We'll see how this ties in with how people viewed all of this. He in 1517 in 1517 he went to the castle cathedral and nailed 95 theses, as they're called, the famous 95 theses, where he castigated the Catholic Church for all sorts of things, including indulgences. And this is regarded, 1517, as the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. This was a challenge by a theologian um, to the Catholic Church. It was a challenge that again, confined to the spiritual domain. Luther wanted to save human souls, not the material lives of human beings, although they were one and the same thing. Okay, let's make that point, because as we'll see, people at the time in Germany and throughout Central Europe, from Switzerland to France, actually, when the peasants took to heart what he was preaching, but followed a disciple of his, not him, did not make the distinguished aspects, the nuances that he provided about the spiritual salvation versus leave the secular domain alone. They didn't see it that way. They saw in the 95 theses that he nailed on the castle door, they saw one thing, and that is a challenge to the legitimacy of authority. And the ultimate authority in Europe at the time was the Catholic Church. There was no greater authority. They represented God on earth, right? Papal infallibility. The Pope cannot be wrong. Dogmatism as far as it gets. So what we have here is the Lutheran challenge to the Catholic Church, to Catholic dogma, at one level, in order to save Christian souls, rejecting clerical intercession, telling people that salvation comes through faith. It's a relationship between the individual's faith and the personal relationship with God, right, at the core of this, not through this communitarian milieu, not through that that the Catholic Church was preaching. You don't need clerical intercession to achieve salvation. You don't need to pay the Catholic Church indulgences to save Catholic intercession. Okay. By the way, I should tell you parenthetically that poor Martin Luther was right, that that at the time, in fact, that he was right, because the papacy was using some of that money actually to instigate wars, which, by the way, is not part of Christian teachings. War is not part of Christian pursuits. Peace is. Not to mention, by the way, acquiring more and more wealth, not to mention that. In any case, the uh, Protestant Reformation unleashed in first in Germany, from Wittenberg out to Germany and all across Central Europe and into parts of eventually Northwest Europe, including the Scandinavian countries, by the way. It unleashed a spirit of freedom from the chains of the Catholic Church, the dogmatism of the Catholic Church. However, it also unleashed the permission of a religious um, figure like Luther, a respected theologian, university professor, a monk, it, to attack authority, which, in the eyes of Europeans at the time, was one and the same. The authority uh, of the Catholic Church was representing the authority of the secular realm, okay, of institutions in the secular realm. Now, Luther's views were accepted by especially the urban middle class, some nobles, um, but also by peasants and workers who understood what he said in their own way. They understood, they put all of that in the context of their own lives. They did not understand the theology of Lutheranism in the spirit that he was offering it, but interpreted it as people do, by the way, because people interpret religion and use religion to justify anything, from peace to war, anything. And again, this is not just now, from the era of the classical period of paganism to the present. Okay, so religion, just as in Luther's time, has always been used. Abraham, the founder, of course, the father of the Abrahamic religions, the father of the Hebrew religion, of Judaism, uh, left took his tribe and left and pronounced his tribal deity the only true God, hence the birth of monotheism, against the pagan city-states and other tribes at the time, as a form of protest. So religion is intertwined, and it is with society, and it has always been political, always, because it is born in a political context, and it is born within society as an expression of what a segment of the population is against, and what it aspires to, and what it hopes for, and the worldview that it entertains. And so Luther was no different in this respect. The one thing that Luther did not address in his critique of the Catholic Church is social justice. Social justice is an important part of society. It means that the marginalized population, which in the time of Martin Luther was increasing, ironically, as Fernand Bourdelle, Emmanuel Wallerstein, others who have dealt with the modern world system theory, point out, what we have is, although the economy is expanding because of the transition from the feudal manorial system to capitalism, what happens is poverty is increasing. And one reason, there are a lot of reasons. One reason is there were inflationary pressures in Europe. Part of it was because of the exploration of new parts of the world by Europeans and the bringing in of products, including precious metals like gold and silver from the New World, which puts inflationary pressures in Europe, but also the enclosure movement, which starts, and it's very slow, and it continues through in the 18th century across Europe, um, which means enclosure is in throughout the Middle Ages. There were common lands, they were called land, forests, lakes, rivers. All these were common lands, lands that laid uncultivated, pasture lands, and so forth. And peasants actually made use of those, and serfs made use of those. They collected fruits and berries, and they hunted and they fished in those lands. So the common lands were very important in the living standards of Europeans. What happened is those were enclosed, that is, privatized, just like there is a privatization under the neoliberal regime in the last 50 years of public property becoming private. This is why there are some scholars of neoliberalism that maintain that we're back in the feudal period. So what we have here in the time of Luther is pressure on uh, land values. In other words, rents go up, property values go up, and there is inflationary pressure. So living standards for Europeans, especially the masses in the rural areas, and that's where the majority of the population was. The division of labor here is before the Industrial Revolution, so the majority of the population is in the rural areas, and also there is a rising working class. Those people suffered at a time, by the way, that when we look at demographics, what happens is the population of Europe rises because the Black Death subsided, and subsided not because they had a medical cure. It's just that since the mid 15th, 14th century, after 1348, when the Black Death broke out, then until the early 16th century, the fact is the people with the weakest immune systems died out over the centuries, and those who survived had immunity to the Black Death. Okay, the pneumonic and the bubonic plague. So we have a rise in the population, and at the same time inflationary pressures. So we have actually downward pressures on both the rural and urban population. This is when Martin Luther comes along and protests against the hypocrisy of the Catholic Church and the fact that they amass material wealth and they sell indulgences. They take the money from the faithful to sell them salvation, false hope, in other words. Um, and that seems to register with Europeans. All not beyond This is beyond Germany, by the way. From Switzerland, is as I said, Lutheranism spreads very quickly. However, Martin Luther was not interested in the issues of social justice. He was well aware. I should tell you there are a lot of articles and books on this issue. Was Luther aware of the role of the state, of the role of the capitalist economy, the transition from feudalism to capitalism? Was he aware of the forging of the market economy, the commercial revolution that was all around him? He lived in a society like that. Of course, he was aware of it. However, that was not his concern. His concern was the spiritual salvation of the individual. Like I said, as though human beings are, the spiritual self is over here on this side, and the material self on this side. There are two different people. This dichotomy, this Augustinian view of the city of God and the city of man. This is what he pursued. However, one of his disciples, his name was Thomas Munzer, of middle class background, just like Luther, lower middle class background, comes along, and he does not see this is a disciple of Luther, someone, by the way, that Luther promoted. Okay, he helped this person. He doesn't see this dichotomy that Luther sees. He sees only one thing, and that is that the abuses of the Catholic Church is the largest, most powerful institution in Europe, the largest landowner in Europe. Okay, the hypocrisy of this institution in preaching spiritual salvation but practicing materialism. Thomas Munzer argues that they are representatives and they are part of the elites, and they are part of the elites, and they are part of a holistic problem, and that is an institutional problem that needs to be addressed. And spiritual egalitarianism is not enough. There must be material egalitarianism. Thomas Munzer, in other words, becomes the first primitive communist, if you will, or Christian communist in Europe. Now, it could be argued, and I'll address this in a few minutes, that someone before Thomas Munzer, an English thinker, Sir Thomas More, argued a very similar thing in his book entitled Utopia, an ancient Greek word which means no place or the ideal place. Okay, we'll talk about Munzer and about Sir Thomas More, Munzer, and Luther in a bit. But Munzer comes along and sees how society is operating and doesn't see this clear division between the church as an institution and the rest of society. He sees religion as an integral part of society, exploiting part of the exploitative system that exists, exploiting the masses, from the serfs. They own serfs too, by the way. From the serfs to the peasants to the workers, these are the victims of this exploitative system of which the Catholic Church was a part. And Munzer doesn't see this dichotomy based on Augustinian theology that Luther sees. Now, before Munzer emerges as the leader of the mass movement in Germany that leads to what is called in German history the German Peasants' War, an uprising, the most important uprising in Europe in the early modern European history until the French Revolution of 1789. This is the most important uprising. It inspired others, by the way. Munzer actually fell into that leadership role because there were peasants and workers, mining workers and dock workers. There were people of the lower classes already looking for leadership to lead them because their lives, their material lives were deteriorating. This is the interesting thing. Again, as those who have studied um, the modern world system theory know the works of Fernand Bourdelle as the um, and that school, the Annales school of thought, the French school of thought, as the economy rises, partly because of the commercial revolution, the transition, money is increasingly concentrated, land is increasingly concentrated, so there is a drop. Yes, the economy increases, however, population increases as well at the same time, and living standards drop. So this is the contradiction. And so you have German peasants and German workers looking for leadership to lead them, and they were in fact inspired those that had heard. Obviously, this is the age before public education. Most of the people were illiterate. It's whatever, and obviously difficult for them to discern the nuances in Luther's theology, in his doctrinal views. Right? This is let's be realistic about this. But Thomas Mutzer comes along and places himself in the leadership position in the city of Mühlhausen in 1524. When Mutzer arrived in Mühlhausen, he found a mass movement ready to be led. And he placed himself at the head of that. And he made it very clear to his followers that there was, and they were receptive, by the way, that there was no difference between the spiritual realm and the temporal realm, the spiritual elites and the secular elites. They were one and the same thing. They were both part of the exploitative system, institutional structure that was responsible for the downward pressure on the masses, on the peasants and the workers. A rebellion breaks out. It is estimated that more than 300,000 people, now this is a lot of people for the early 16th century, and they take part in this revolution, this social revolution. And this spreads, like I said, sporadic revolutions from Switzerland to France. It spreads throughout Central Europe. There are sporadic peasant revolutions, uprisings. All of them failed, by the way. Nevertheless, they set a precedent for social revolutions in Europe all the way up to, there was nothing like this, all the way up to the French Revolution of 1789, okay, which was a secular revolution, not a religious one like this one. This, in other words, the articulation of this one was religious, but the substantive issues were very secular. They were about the economy, the division of labor, the concentration of wealth, the privatization of public lands, and the squeezing of the peasants and the workers in an economy that was expanding, ironically, but money was concentrated. Now, the Thomas Münzer became, Martin Luther became famous for the 95 Theses. Thomas Münzer became famous for the 12 Articles. The 12 Articles became the manifesto, the revolutionary manifesto of the German Peasants' War, basically listing the grievances of the people, of the rebels. Again, 300,000 involved in this. By the way, historians who have written about this point out that there were actually a great deal more who sympathized. They simply would not leave their work to go and take part in the rebellion. So let's be clear about this. It's not just the 300,000. It's the vast majority of the peasants and the workers that agreed with this. It's just that they would not leave their families, not attend to the fields and so forth, to the animals, in order to go to the revolution, take part in the rebellion, which, by the way, had a risk, as we'll see. So what happens is the rebellion takes place in 1524, 1525, after a series, and this is a series of crop failures and again prices of commodities going up, beginning, I believe, in 1502, 1503. So we have a series all the way up to the 1520s, the mid 1520s, when the German Peasant War takes place. We have a series of economic crisis, contractions, partly because of what nature did, that with crop failures. Nevertheless, this is added pressure to existing inflationary pressures because of precious minerals coming in, undermining the German mining industry itself, and more land privatized, more and more wealth concentrated. While at the same time, what we have is the rising capitalist class in the urban centers in Germany, bankers and merchants guarding their interests, the landowners wanting to guard their interests, the upper clergy very guarded about its interests and its role in society. And Martin Luther finds out about all of this, and he immediately condemns Thomas Mutzer and the rebels and asks both, to give you an idea how well aware he was, by the way, Martin Luther was well aware that there indeed was no distinction between temporal and spiritual estates. They were one and the same thing. They came from the same social class, the upper class. He calls on them to cut down these rebels, to stop them, and clearly sides with the elites. So Luther made his position clear. He was only interested in the spiritual salvation, and he wanted obedience to the status quo, to the secular institutions. Okay? And in fact, that's what happens. The well-trained and highly disciplined forces that went after the rebels easily defeated them in 1525. Thomas Munzer was executed, by the way, and that was the end of the rebellion. There were other intermittent peasant rebellions between the German Peasants' War and the French Revolution. They were not successful. The French Revolution was successful, despite the fact that it resulted at the very end, of course, the result was the rise of Napoleon and then the restoration, that is the monarchy, the Bourbon monarchy coming back. But there were more French revolutions, 1830, 1848, and 1870. So the French Revolution did have a much more lasting impact. Now, I want to end this by pointing out that Luther provided an ideology replete in contradictions. On the one hand, there was the revolution from above to attacking the Western Christendom, the Catholic Church, to have the faithful pursue a different route to salvation. So there was a revolution against the Catholic Church. However, there was a reactionary and there was, I should say, not just a revolution from above in this sense, but there was the idea of spiritual egalitarianism. However, when it came to the social structure and secular institutions, there was the defense of the existing social structure, and this is the contradiction. How do you attack the Catholic Church as though it's on another planet rather than this one where there is a social structure in which the Catholic Church was born and it operates in? Okay. Hence the realism of the Munzer view of how society operates and what needs to be addressed, which is the more basic question of social justice. In any case, Luther did not want systemic change. He wanted systemic change in the religious realm, but not in the secular realm. But how do you get that and not wind up, in fact, siding with existing elites? Luther was backed by, and there is a famous painting of him, by the way. When you look at the painting, you see behind him are nobles, behind him are very powerful people. Luther was realistic. The power base of his Reformation theology was indeed the upper crust of Germany and the bourgeoisie. He represented the new capitalist system as it was emerging. And he, although he recognized, by the way, that there is a role of the state during the commercial revolution, which is in fact to regulate the economy and to avoid extreme wealth. Let me be very clear. Luther did, although he condemned the rebels during the German war, German Peasants' War, he was realistic. And at one point, he mentioned that they're doing this because they're exploited. He was very realistic. They're doing this because they have grievances which are legitimate. However, he was against it because he wanted to preserve the status quo. Now, there was another man, and I mentioned him already, Thomas More, Sir Thomas More, in England. 1 year before Luther's 95 Theses, in 1516, Sir Thomas More wrote Utopia. Sir Thomas More, by the way, was also executed like Munzer for different reasons in England. Sir Thomas More's Utopia looked at the early 16th century more or less like Munzer did, not like Luther did. Thomas More was loyal to the Catholic Church. Thomas More was in support of the communitarian value system. He lamented that society was changing, evolving toward capitalism in social discontinuity. And he saw that society was evolving toward a very harsh political economy where it would leave behind the vast majority of the people exploited. Thomas More Utopia was also a primitive communist manifesto. This is long before Marx. Just like the 12 articles of Munzer, primitive Christian communism, Thomas More had his own version. So you have these three people, Martin Luther in the early 16th century, his disciple Thomas Munzer, and then Thomas More independently in England, not in Germany, looking at the same environment of European social discontinuity and seeing something different. Thomas Munzer and Thomas More did see the commonality of elites in the religious realm and the secular realm serve each other, by the way. Religion throughout history has always been an integral part of the elite structure, okay? Giving legitimacy to rulers and elites. Luther knew that, by the way. Luther was a very intelligent individual. He was not naive. He chose this. However, the contradiction is that the very system which he criticized, that namely the Catholic Church and clerical intercession, the very system he criticized, and of course in forming a German national church. By the way, he translated the Bible into German. This is the beginning of nation states in Europe. This is the formative stage. He translated the Bible into German. He represented the spirit of nationalism, okay, in Europe. And he was well aware that the capitalist elites, as they were, and the old aristocracy, as they merged their interests, they were merging their interests because the surplus that was produced in the countryside, this is before the Industrial Revolution, before the rise of manufacturing, mass production, okay, that was sold to traders, to through commerce, to intermediate and long distance trade. So these people, the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, and the aristocracy had interests that were intertwined. Luther knew that. He, in fact, represented the spirit of capitalism. And one of the reasons that in the late 19th century, the German sociologist, very famous, of course, in the West for many different reasons, Max Weber, who pushed the Protestant work ethic theory, and they argued that the Protestant Reformation of Luther and John Calvin, by the way, Max Weber relies more on Calvin than Luther, but Luther very important here. The Weber thesis of the Protestant work ethic and the rise of capitalism is very important in modern sociology and modern scholarship. In my view, however, and in the view of many, I'm not the first one to mention this. This goes back to the 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, because Max Weber lived during this period. The Weber thesis has been challenged ever since it was advanced, namely because the question is whether the Protestant Reformation gave rise and helped to buttress the capitalist system, which it did, by the way, because it provided an ideological framework before the rise of secular ideology, before Adam Smith, before John Locke and Adam Smith, right? Okay, granted. Or, as many, and I'm one of those, argue, it is the capitalist system in the age of social discontinuity that gave rise to the Protestant Reformation. Question is, what came first? Clearly, capitalism. Luther arrives in the early 16th century. The embryonic stage of capitalism had already started before that. Okay. The so-called long 16th century is in the mid 15th century, and it goes into the 16th and early 17th century. So the embryonic stage of capitalism in the long 16th century is what gives rise to the Protestant Reformation. Capitalism is responsible for the Protestant Reformation. And if you look at a map of Europe, by the way, what you find is that mostly Northwest Europe, where capitalists were prominent, become Protestant. Okay, whether Calvinist or Lutheran, there are other forms of Protestantism, by the way, Methodists and so forth, that emerge after Luther, after Calvin. But it's interesting that there is a correlation between where capitalism was successful in France, which remains Catholic, by the way, the Huguenots within France, which were Protestant, the Huguenots become very important there. Okay, so there is a correlation between the rise of capitalism first and then Protestantism following, because it suits the value system and the ideology of the capitalist class. The legacy of Lutheranism and the Protestant Reformation has been enduring. It transformed Europe and it transformed the Western world and wherever the Europeans went throughout the world. It has had a lasting impact all the way to today in the era of neoliberalism. In Germany, the particular brand of neoliberalism that emerges from in the war during the war and the Second World War and post-war period, which is called ordoliberalism, which is basically the German word for order, which basically means that the state becomes a vehicle to support the neoliberal political economy. What many call today the corporate welfare model, with a state-backed institutional support for it. Okay, Martin Luther was not against the state. He was not a free enterprise advocate, just like neoliberals who claim they are, but they're not. They want the state to simply be there to support the capitalists, and the state historically has had a very important role in redistributing income through the fiscal and monetary system, okay? Namely, redistributing income in this case under neoliberalism from the bottom up, from the masses, from the middle class and the working class to the capitalist class. This is not what Luther would have advocated, because Luther was well aware of the exploitation that was taking place. He wanted, he was in favor of the new social order, but did not advocate the excesses of the new social order. Today, of course, we are in the age where the Protestant Reformation, the Protestant work ethic, the Weber thesis thrives under neoliberalism, because it stresses individual endeavors, the work ethic, and the value system that is against the communitarian view that the Catholic Church was promoting at the time of Luther, and in favor of atomism, an ancient Greek word which means, of course, a self-promotion, self-centered endeavor. Atomism is the self. So it's in contrast to the community, to the social welfare. Again, there are many branches of Lutheranism from the right to the left today. Some advocate, some are very, they're apologists for neoliberalism. Others are critical of neoliberalism and are, in fact, have moved toward the realm of social justice, closer to what Thomas Müntzer, Luther's disciple, was advocating. But the legacy of the Protestant Reformation is with us today, and the Protestant Reformation's core value of individualism and atomism, finding God, finding salvation through the self, and separating the individual from the collective, and also giving the individual something to hope for, namely salvation in the next life, right? Don't bother with social justice in this life. That suits the capitalist elites just fine. It always has, regardless of whether they're Catholic or Protestant, by the way. That is a very important legacy of Lutheranism, okay? To, in fact, have a docile population that accepts It's fate. Okay? And blame the self, after all, and this is more so in Calvinism than it is in Lutheranism, after all, if you're not excelling, it's because of your own failure as an individual. It's not the public policy. It's not the government. It's not the state adopting policies which have brought you, and by you I mean the masses in society, the working class and the lower middle class, to the state that you're in. It's your own fault. Okay? So this has served capitalism very well, especially under the neoliberal model. I'm going to end it there. I'm going to thank you for watching. Please write comments, ask questions, and by all means, join this educational channel. Thank you for watching.